The silence in my apartment had a texture. It was thick, like old dust motes suspended in a sunbeam, clinging to the furniture and settling in my lungs. For 2 years, this silence had been my most constant companion, a roommate who paid no rent but took up all the space. My life was a series of quiet, repeating loops. Wake, work from my laptop at the small desk crammed into the corner of my living room, eat something forgettable, sleep. It was a grayscale existence, and I had long since stopped trying to find the color. I was an observer of my own life, watching it pass from behind a pane of glass I couldn't seem to break. The leak started as a whisper, a faint, rhythmic drip from under the kitchen sink that I ignored for a week, hoping it would get tired of its own monologue and stop. It did not. It grew bolder, a persistent patter that mocked the quiet I'd so carefully cultivated. It was a problem I couldn't solve with a software patch or a line of code. It required a person, a stranger. The thought alone sent a prickle of anxiety up my spine. My friend, Clara, had been the one to recommend him. "Oh, you have to call Julian," she'd said, her voice bright and certain over the phone. "He's incredible. He practically rebuilt my back deck with his bare hands. And he's looking for extra work." I had mumbled something noncommittal, but the dripping was getting worse, and the dark, spreading stain on the floorboards was starting to look accusatory. So I had called. His voice on the phone was exactly what you'd expect from a man who rebuilt decks with his bare hands. It was low and had a rough, gravelly edge to it, like stones tumbling in a slow river. It was a voice that felt solid, grounded. It made my own sound thin and reedy in comparison. We agreed on a time. Thursday, 3 o'clock. The appointment loomed in my calendar like a verdict. On Thursday, at precisely 3 o'clock, the buzzer shrieked, a violent tear in the fabric of my afternoon quiet. My heart jumped into my throat. I pressed the talk button, my hand slightly unsteady. "Hello, Julian," the gravelly voice said, followed by the faint crackle of the ancient intercom system. "For the leak. Right. Come up. Apartment 4B. The walk from the intercom to the front door was a long one. I smoothed down my t-shirt, a nervous, pointless gesture. I ran a hand through my hair. Why was I so agitated? He was a handyman, not a blind date. He was here to fix a pipe, not to scrutinize the quiet disarray of my life. Still, my pulse was a frantic drum against my ribs. I opened the door just as he reached the top of the stairs. And there he was. Clara had neglected to mention a few key details. She'd mentioned he was capable. She had not mentioned that he was the kind of man who seemed to have been carved from warmer, denser earth than the rest of us. He was tall, with broad shoulders that strained the fabric of his simple gray Henley. His dark hair was a little too long, curling over the collar of his shirt. A day or two of stubble shadowed a strong jaw, and his eyes were a startling, intelligent hazel, flecked with gold. They took in my apartment over my shoulder before settling on my face, and for a moment, I felt pinned, completely seen. "Leo?" he asked, and the corner of his mouth tilted up in a way that wasn't quite a smile, but held the promise of one. A mischievous grin, I would later learn to call it. "Yeah. Hi. Come in." My voice was a croak. I stepped back, holding the door open wider, and he moved past me into the small entryway. A wave of scent followed him, not cologne, but something cleaner, more elemental. Sawdust, a hint of citrus soap, and the faint, warm smell of clean sweat. It was the scent of a body that worked, that moved through the world with purpose. It filled my sterile, silent apartment with an undeniable sense of life. He set a heavy-looking toolbox on the floor with a solid thud. "So, the great flood of 4B. Where's the crime scene?" I managed a weak smile, feeling my own awkwardness as a physical thing, a clumsy coat I couldn't take off. "In the kitchen. Follow me." I led him through the living room, hyper-aware of his presence behind me. He moved with an easy, confident grace that made my own careful steps feel stiff and robotic. I could feel his gaze on the back of my neck, or maybe I was just imagining it. My skin tingled either way. This was the most alive my apartment had felt in years. It was also the most scrutinized I had felt. In the kitchen, I pointed to the cabinet under the sink. "It's in there." It's gotten enthusiastic. Julian crouched down, his jeans pulling tight across his thighs. He opened the cabinet doors and peered into the damp darkness. I stood a few feet away, hovering uselessly, watching the way his shirt stretched across his back as he reached inside. The muscles there shifted and bunched with the movement. I found myself staring, mesmerized by the simple, fluid mechanics of his body. I had to consciously force my eyes away, fixing them on a neutral spot on the wall. "All right, I see the problem," his voice echoed slightly from inside the cabinet. "Looks like the seal on the P-trap is completely shot, and this whole pipe is corroded. It all needs to come out." He backed out of the cabinet and stood up, wiping his hands on his jeans. He was closer than I'd realized. I could see the faint lines around his eyes, the way the flecks of gold in them seemed to catch the light. "Is that a big job?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He gave me that half-smile again. "Not for me, but I'll need to go grab the right parts. I can be back in an hour, if that works for you." "Yes, that's fine." "Perfect." I was probably too eager. "Okay." He held my gaze for a beat too long. A strange, charged silence stretched between us, thick with the sound of the dripping pipe and my own ragged breathing. It felt like a question was being asked, one I didn't have the language to understand, let alone answer. Then he broke the contact, turning to grab his toolbox. "Be back soon, Leo." He said my name like it was a familiar word, something he'd said 1,000 times. It sounded different in his low, gravelly voice. Solid. Real. He left, and the apartment was plunged back into its usual silence. But it wasn't the same. The texture had changed. It was no longer empty. It was expectant. It was filled with the ghost of his presence, the lingering scent of sawdust and soap. I walked back to the kitchen and stood where he had stood, my heart still hammering a strange, unfamiliar rhythm against my ribs. An hour. I had an hour to get myself under control. An hour to remember how to be the quiet, invisible man I had been just 10 minutes ago. But as I stood there, a ridiculous, hopeful, terrifying thought bloomed in my chest. I didn't want to. For the next hour, I was a ghost in my own home, pacing the worn floorboards. I tried to work, opening my laptop and staring at the lines of code, but the letters swam before my eyes, meaningless. All I could think about was the way he'd filled the doorway, the easy confidence in his movements, the unsettling perception in his gaze. I was a man who specialized in control, in creating ordered systems within the chaos of the digital world. My own life was a carefully curated, if lonely, system. Julian's arrival had been like a random, unpredictable variable thrown into the code, and the whole program was threatening to crash. I found myself cleaning. I wiped down counters that were already clean, straightened a stack of books that was already neat. It was a nervous, frantic energy, a need to impose order on my space as a way of imposing it on my thoughts. I was preparing the apartment, I realized with a jolt of self-awareness. Preparing it for him, as if he would care that the throw pillows were perfectly plumped. The thought was so absurd it was almost funny. Almost. Mostly, it was just deeply pathetic. When the buzzer rang again, exactly 58 minutes later, I jumped. This time, I didn't hesitate. I buzzed him up and opened the door, leaning against the frame to feign a casualness I was nowhere near feeling. He came up the stairs 2 at a time, carrying a long cardboard box of parts. He wasn't even breathing hard. He gave me a genuine, full smile this time, and it was like a sudden, bright light in the dim hallway. "Round 2, he said, his voice warm. "Welcome back to the disaster zone," I replied, and the words came out smoother than I expected. Maybe I could do this. Maybe I could pretend to be a normal, well-adjusted human being for a few hours. He followed me back to the kitchen and set down the box. "All right, first things first, I need to shut off the main water line to your unit. Do you know where that is?" I blinked. No, I have no idea." He chuckled, a low, pleasant sound. "No worries. Usually in a closet or the basement. We'll go on a little treasure hunt." The hunt led us to the small, cramped utility closet near the front door. It was filled with my vacuum cleaner, a box of old college textbooks I couldn't bring myself to throw away, and a general sense of neglect. Julian peered inside, then gestured for me to move. "Mind if I squeeze in there?" "Be my guest." I stepped aside, and he moved past me into the tight space. The closet was so small that he had to turn sideways, his shoulder brushing against mine as he passed. The contact was brief, accidental, but it sent a jolt of heat straight through me. I could feel the solid muscle of his arm, the warmth of his skin through the thin fabric of our shirts. My breath caught in my chest. I didn't move away. I stood frozen, my entire being focused on that single point of contact. He didn't seem to notice, or if he did, he gave no sign. He was focused on the tangle of pipes at the back of the closet. "Ah, there we go," he murmured, his voice slightly muffled. "The red handle. That's our guy." He reached in, his body pressing more firmly against mine as he strained to turn the old, stiff valve. The side of his body was flush against me now, from shoulder to hip. I could smell the clean, warm scent of his skin, feel the subtle shift of his body as he worked. I was trapped between him and the doorframe, surrounded by him. My mind went completely, blissfully blank. All thought was replaced by pure sensation. The warmth, the pressure, the faint, clean scent. Time seemed to slow down, to stretch and warp around us in the confines of the tiny closet. I was intensely aware of my own breathing, trying to keep it even, terrified he would hear the frantic pounding of my heart. His arm was against my chest, and I could feel the strength in it as he finally wrenched the valve shut with a groan of protesting metal. "Got it," he said, his voice a low rumble so close to my ear that it vibrated through my skull. He relaxed, but he didn't immediately move away. For a long, breathless moment, we just stood there, pressed together in the dark. My mind screamed at me to step back, to create space, to say something normal and casual. But my body wouldn't obey. It was rooted to the spot, greedy for the contact. Then, he shifted, pulling back slowly. "Sorry about that," he said, his voice still low. "It's a tight squeeze." He looked at me, his hazel eyes dark and unreadable in the dim light of the hallway. Was it my imagination, or was his gaze lingering on my mouth? "No problem," I managed to say, my voice thick. He nodded, a short, sharp gesture, and then turned back to the kitchen. The spell was broken. I leaned against the wall for a second after he was gone, my legs feeling strangely weak. My shoulder, my arm, my entire right side tingled where he had touched me. It was the most significant physical contact I'd had with another human being in months, maybe years. And it had been an accident. It had to be an accident. I followed him back to the kitchen, feeling like I was walking in a dream. He was already on his knees, laying out his tools on a towel on the floor. He worked with a focused, efficient grace that was captivating to watch. His hands, I noticed, were large and capable, with clean, short-trimmed nails but a scattering of small cuts and calluses across the knuckles. They were hands that knew how to fix things, how to build things, how to take something broken and make it whole again. I leaned against the counter, trying to look casual, trying to pretend I wasn't watching his every move. I was supposed to be working, but the thought of my laptop in the other room felt like a memory from another life. This was real. The sound of the wrench turning, the scrape of metal on metal, the quiet grunts of effort he made as he worked. "So, you're a programmer?" he asked, not looking up from his task. The question caught me off guard. "Yeah. How did you know?" "Your friend Clara mentioned it. Said you were some kind of code wizard." He glanced up at me, a teasing glint in his eye. "Don't see many wizards around these days." I felt a flush creep up my neck. I wouldn't say wizard. I mostly just stare at a screen until my eyes burn. He chuckled. "I get that. Sometimes I feel like I just stare at pipes until my back gives out." He paused, looking at the new pipe in his hand. "It's all just problem solving, I guess. You do it with logic and symbols. I do it with wrenches and copper fittings." "I guess so," I said, surprised by the easy comparison. I'd always thought of my work as abstract, cerebral. He made it sound practical, grounded, just like him. We fell into a comfortable silence as he worked. It wasn't the heavy, empty silence I was used to. It was a shared silence, filled with the ambient sounds of his labor. I found myself relaxing, the knot of anxiety in my stomach slowly unspooling. I wasn't performing. I was just being. And he was just being, too. After a while, he sat back on his heels, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. "All right, the old stuff is out. Time to fit the new." He picked up a piece of shiny copper pipe and a small canister. "This part is a little like sculpture. You have to get the joints just right." I watched, fascinated, as he carefully applied flux to the pipe and fitted the pieces together. His movements were precise, economical. There was a quiet artistry to it that I had never considered. He wasn't just a handyman. He was a craftsman. "You're good at that," I said, the words slipping out before I could stop them. He looked up, a hint of surprise on his face, followed by that small, pleased smile. Thanks. I like making things work. It's satisfying. He held up the newly joined pipes. See? A perfect fit. His eyes met mine over the copper pipe, and again, that strange, charged current passed between us. A perfect fit. The words hung in the air, suddenly imbued with a weight they shouldn't have had. My mouth was dry. I felt like I was on the edge of something, a precipice I couldn't see. I was supposed to be the observer, safe behind my glass wall. But he was right there, on the other side of it, his gaze steady and direct, and I could feel the first cracks beginning to form. He held my gaze for another long moment before clearing his throat and turning back to the task at hand. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. My internal monologue was a frantic, looping mess. What was that? Was he flirting? No, of course not. He's just being friendly. You're reading into things. You're lonely, and you're projecting. Stop it. But my heart wouldn't listen to my head. It continued its frantic, hopeful rhythm, a wild, rebellious drumbeat in the quiet of my kitchen. The rest of the repair passed in a blur of this strange, new tension, a dance of proximity and retreat. He would ask me to hold a flashlight, and our fingers would brush as I passed it to him. He would stand up and turn, finding me closer than he expected, and we would both freeze for a fraction of a second before one of us would mutter an apology and step away. Each accidental touch was a spark, each shared glance a held breath. My apartment, once a sanctuary of solitude, had become a minefield of unspoken possibilities. I was a scientist observing a new, volatile element. I cataloged his every micro-expression, the way his brow furrowed in concentration, the slight quirk of his lips when he was trying not to smile, the way his eyes would darken when he looked at me, a fleeting shadow of something I couldn't name passing through their hazel depths. I was overthinking, I knew. I was building a fantasy out of friendliness and close quarters. But the analysis was a defense mechanism, a way to process the overwhelming flood of feeling he inspired in me without having to actually acknowledge it. He finished connecting the final pipe. Okay, he said, his voice echoing slightly as he leaned back under the sink. Let's see if we've tamed the beast. Can you go turn the water back on? Slowly. On it. I practically fled to the utility closet, grateful for the distance. My hands were shaking as I gripped the cold metal of the valve. I turned it slowly, as instructed, hearing the gurgle and rush of water returning to the pipes. I waited, listening for the telltale drip. There was only silence. I walked back to the kitchen, my steps hesitant. Julian was just backing out from under the sink. He had a smudge of grease on his cheek. Well? He asked, looking up at me. I don't hear anything, I said, a genuine smile breaking across my face. I think you did it. Let's have a look. He stood up, his face serious as he opened and closed the cabinet, checking the new fittings with his hand. He ran the faucet, letting the water splash into the basin. We both leaned over, peering at the shiny new copper pipes. They were bone dry. Perfect, he said, and the relief in his voice was mirrored in the sudden release of tension in my own shoulders. He turned to me, a wide, triumphant grin on his face. It transformed him, making him look younger, more carefree. No more floods. Thank you, I said, and the words felt inadequate. Seriously, thank you, Julian. All in a day's work, he began gathering his tools, the easy rhythm of his movements returning. The job was done. The transaction was complete. In a few minutes, he would be gone, and my apartment would be silent again. The thought landed in my chest with a dull, heavy thud. How much do I owe you? I asked, my voice flat. He paused, his back to me. Let's call it 75 for the parts and 100 for labor. So, 175. Okay, I went to my desk to grab my wallet, my movements slow, reluctant. I was trying to stretch out these last few moments. When I came back, he was standing by the door, his toolbox in his hand. The apartment already felt bigger, emptier. I counted out the cash and handed it to him. Our fingers brushed again as he took the bills. This time, the contact lingered. His fingers closed over mine for a second, a brief, warm pressure, before he took the money. My eyes shot up to his. His expression was unreadable, his mouth set in a neutral line. But his eyes were doing that thing again. They were dark, intense, searching my face for something. Thanks, Leo, he said, his voice low. Thank you. I repeated, my own voice barely a whisper. He nodded, then turned and opened the door. He stepped out into the hallway, and I felt a wave of cold, desolate disappointment wash over me. It was over. I had imagined it all. Then he stopped. He turned back, one hand on the doorknob. "Hey," he said. My head snapped up. "Yeah." He hesitated for a second, looking down the empty hallway, and then back at me. I do other stuff, too. Not just plumbing. Shelves, painting, you know. If you ever need anything else." Was this a business pitch? Or was it something more? An excuse? A reason to come back? Hope, sharp and painful, pierced through my disappointment. "Oh," I said, my mind racing. I looked around my living room, at the blank, white walls. "Actually, I've been thinking about painting this room. For a while now." The lie was effortless, born of sheer desperation. A slow smile spread across Julian's face. It was the smile of a man who had just won a small, important victory. "Yeah? What color were you thinking?" I don't know. Something less white." He chuckled, a rich, warm sound that filled the hallway. "I can help with that. We could go look at some swatches this weekend, if you want." This weekend. He wasn't just offering a service, he was offering his time. He was creating a reason for us to see each other again, outside the context of a broken pipe. My heart was doing a frantic, joyful dance in my chest. "Yeah," I said, trying to sound casual, trying to hide the ridiculous, giddy grin that was threatening to take over my face. "Yeah, that would be great." "Cool." He nodded, his smile softening into something more genuine, more gentle. "I'll text you." And then he was gone, the door clicking shut behind him, leaving me alone in my blessedly, beautifully silent apartment. I leaned against the door, the wood cool against my back, and let out a long, shaky breath. The silence was different now. It was no longer an oppressive weight. It was a space, waiting to be filled. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt like I had something to look forward to. The prospect of choosing a paint color had never seemed so thrilling. The text came 2 hours later. Just as I was starting to convince myself I'd hallucinated the entire exchange, my phone buzzed on the desk beside me. A number I didn't recognize. "Hey, it's Julian, the pipe whisperer. Still up for a paint swatch adventure this weekend?" My fingers trembled slightly as I typed my reply. I deleted it 3 times before settling on something that sounded remotely human. "Definitely. The walls are quaking in fear already. Saturday work for you?" His reply was almost instantaneous. "Saturday's perfect. I'll pick you up around noon. We can hit the hardware store, grab some lunch." Lunch. He wanted to have lunch with me. This was escalating beyond a simple business arrangement. My anxiety and excitement swirled together into a dizzying, unfamiliar cocktail. "Sounds like a plan." I put my phone down and stared at it, a stupid, hopeful smile plastered on my face. The pipe whisperer. The playful nickname sent a ridiculous warmth spreading through my chest. He was funny. He was charming. And he wanted to spend his Saturday with me. Saturday arrived with an agonizing slowness. I changed my outfit 4 times, cycling through every possible combination of jeans and vaguely presentable shirts I owned, before settling on the first thing I'd put on. I was a wreck. My internal monologue was a relentless stream of second-guessing. Was this a date? Was I supposed to think it was a date? Or was he just a genuinely friendly guy who liked to get lunch with his clients? The latter seemed far more likely. And yet, I couldn't shake the memory of his hand lingering on mine, the intensity in his eyes. He arrived at my door at noon, just as promised. He was wearing a soft, faded flannel shirt, unbuttoned over a black t-shirt, and the same worn-in jeans. He looked relaxed, comfortable, and impossibly handsome. "Ready to go?" he asked, his smile easy and immediate. "Ready as I'll ever be to confront that many shades of beige," I said, grabbing my keys. The hardware store was an assault on the senses. The smell of cut lumber, fertilizer, and paint fumes filled the air. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. It was Julian's world, not mine. He navigated the wide aisles with a familiar confidence, grabbing a cart and heading straight for the paint section. "Okay, Leo," he said, turning to me with a mock-serious expression. "This is the big moment. What's the vibe we're going for? Moody and mysterious? Bright and optimistic? I haven't seen the sun in 3 years chic." I laughed, a real, unforced laugh. Definitely the last one. But maybe it's time for a change. "I think so." He gestured to the wall of 1,000 colors, a dizzying rainbow of possibilities. "The world is your oyster." Or, you know, your seafoam dream, or urban dusk. For the next hour, we stood in front of that wall, and I watched him more than I watched the paint swatches. I watched the way he'd pick up a color, hold it at arm's length, and tilt his head, his expression thoughtful. I watched the way his eyes would crinkle at the corners when he made a joke about a particularly hideous shade of orange. He'd hold a swatch of deep, calming blue next to my face. "What do you think? This one brings out your eyes." My heart skipped a beat. He said it casually, a playful comment, but my face still flushed with heat. "I think you're just trying to sell me on the most expensive brand." I deflected, my voice a little tight. He just grinned, a slow, knowing grin that made my stomach do a nervous flip. Caught me. We settled on a color called Steel River, a rich, complex gray blue that was neither too dark nor too light. It felt like his voice, I thought, and then immediately chided myself for the ridiculously poetic notion. "Good choice," he said, his voice full of genuine approval. "This is going to look amazing." After buying the paint and a bewildering array of rollers, trays, and tape, he drove us to a small sandwich shop he knew. It was a hole-in-the-wall place with worn wooden booths and the best pastrami I'd ever tasted. The conversation flowed more easily than I could have ever hoped. I found myself telling him about my job, about the intricate logic puzzles I solved every day. He listened intently, asking smart questions, his chin resting on his hand as he watched me talk. He told me about himself, too. He'd grown up in a small town upstate, had worked construction with his dad since he was a teenager. He'd moved to the city 5 years ago, looking for something different, though he wasn't sure what. He spoke of his work with a quiet passion, a pride in his own competence that I found deeply attractive. "I just like fixing things," he said, shrugging as if it were the simplest thing in the world. "Seeing a problem and making it right. It's clean." I understood that. It was the same satisfaction I got from debugging a line of code, from finding the one misplaced semicolon that was causing a cascade of errors. We were more alike than I had thought. As we were leaving the sandwich shop, he paused by the door. "So," he said, his tone shifting slightly, becoming more serious. "When do you want to start this project?" "Oh, whenever you're free," I said, my mind still buzzing from the easy intimacy of our lunch. "I'm free tomorrow," he said, his gaze direct. "Tomorrow? Sunday?" He wanted to spend his entire weekend in my apartment. "Really? You don't have to do that." "I want to," he said, and the simple declaration sent another jolt through me. There was no subtext there. It was a plain statement of fact. "I want to." "Okay," I said, my voice soft. "Tomorrow, then." The next day, he arrived with coffee for both of us and an old, paint-splattered t-shirt that he changed into in my bathroom. When he emerged, the shirt was stretched tight across his chest, and his arms, dusted with a fine layer of dark hair, were bare. I felt a lump form in my throat. This was going to be a very, very long day. The work was a revelation. I had expected to be a hindrance, a clumsy assistant at best. But Julian was a patient teacher. He showed me how to properly tape the edges of the walls, how to load a roller with just the right amount of paint, how to apply it in long, even strokes. "You're a natural," he said, after watching me paint a section of wall with intense, focused concentration. "I'm just following the algorithm you gave me," I replied, a little breathless from the effort and his proximity. He was standing right behind me, his voice a low murmur near my ear. We worked in a comfortable, companionable rhythm. We put on music, an eclectic mix from his phone that ranged from old soul to indie rock. We didn't talk much, but the silence was filled with the soft swish of the rollers, the harmony of two people working towards a common goal. At one point, we were working on the same wall, moving in tandem. I reached for more paint at the same time he did, our hands bumping over the tray. "Sorry," I muttered, pulling my hand back as if burned. "It's okay," he said, his voice quiet. He didn't pull his hand back. Instead, he turned his palm up slightly, his fingers brushing against mine in a deliberate, questioning touch. It wasn't an accident this time. It couldn't be. It was an invitation. I held my breath. My mind was screaming, a cacophony of fear and hope. "Do something. Don't do anything. This is your chance. You're going to ruin it." Slowly, tentatively, I uncurled my own fingers, letting them rest against his. His skin was warm, slightly rough from work. He responded by lacing his fingers through mine, his grip gentle but firm. We stood there for a long moment, our hands intertwined over the paint tray, the music swelling around us. My heart was a thunderous roar in my ears. I couldn't look at him. I just stared at our joined hands, at the startling, beautiful contrast of his tanned, capable hand holding my pale, hesitant one. He squeezed my hand once, a brief, reassuring pressure, and then he let go. He picked up his roller and went back to painting as if nothing had happened. But everything had happened. A line had been crossed. A question had been asked and answered, all without a single word. For the rest of the afternoon, the air between us was electric. The tension was no longer anxious. It was humming, alive with a shared secret. Every time our eyes met, I saw a new warmth there, a new softness. The half-smile he gave me now was less mischievous and more intimate. We finished the first coat as the afternoon sun began to slant through the windows, casting long shadows across the floor. The room was transformed. The Steel River blue was deep and calming, making the space feel both larger and more intimate at the same time. "Wow," I said, looking around in genuine awe. "It looks amazing." "Told you," Julian said, leaning against the opposite wall, a smear of blue paint on his jaw. "Just needed a little color." He was looking at me, not the walls, and I knew he wasn't just talking about the paint. We ordered pizza for dinner, sitting on a drop cloth in the middle of the living room floor, surrounded by the smell of paint and the comfortable exhaustion of a day's hard work. We were both splattered with blue. I had a streak of it in my hair, and he had a perfect handprint on the back of his jeans where he'd wiped his hand. "You know," he said, in between bites of pizza, "for a code wizard, you're pretty good with a roller." "I had a good teacher," I said, my eyes meeting his over the greasy cardboard box. The silence that followed was different again. It was soft, expectant. He set down his crust and wiped his hands on a napkin. He just looked at me, his hazel eyes searching my face. I felt stripped bare under his gaze, all my loneliness and yearning laid out for him to see. I was terrified, but for the first time, I wasn't trying to hide it. "Leo," he said, his voice low and serious. "Do you ever? I mean, are you?" He trailed off, seeming to struggle for the words. It was the first time I had ever seen him look uncertain. I knew what he was asking. The question hung between us, fragile and monumental. My entire future seemed to hinge on my answer. The old me, the observer behind the glass, would have deflected, made a joke, pretended not to understand. But the old me hadn't spent the day painting a room with this man. The old me hadn't felt his hand in mine. So I took a breath. "I am here. This is happening." I nodded. Just a small, single nod. My throat was too tight to speak. A wave of relief washed over his face, so profound it was like watching the sun break through the clouds. The tension in his shoulders eased. He let out a slow breath. "Okay," he whispered. "Good." He didn't say anything else. He just held my gaze, and in his eyes, I saw it all. The same hope, the same fear, the same deep, aching yearning I felt in my own chest. It was a mirror, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of my own reflection. The moment was broken by the buzz of his phone on the floor beside him. He glanced at it, his brow furrowing. "Sorry, I have to take this." He stood up and walked over to the window, turning his back to me for privacy. I sat on the floor, my heart still hammering, my mind reeling. He knew. I had told him, and he had said, "Good." The word echoed in my head. "Good." His voice from the window was low, but I could hear the edge of frustration in it. "No, I told you I was busy today. Because I am. Look, can we talk about this later?" There was a long pause. "Fine. Yes, I'll be there soon." He ended the call and stood with his back to me for a moment, his hand braced against the window frame. When he turned around, the easy warmth was gone from his face, replaced by a guarded, frustrated expression. "Sorry," he said, his voice tight. "I have to go. Something came up." The sudden shift was like a physical blow. The beautiful, fragile bubble of intimacy we had built all day popped, leaving a cold, empty silence in its place. "Oh," I said, my voice small. "Is everything okay?" "It's fine. It's just complicated." He wouldn't meet my eyes. He was already pulling on his flannel shirt, grabbing his keys. The easy, confident man from this afternoon was gone, replaced by a stranger who couldn't get out of my apartment fast enough. "Julian," I said, standing up. I needed to say something, to anchor us back to the moment we'd had just minutes before. He paused at the door, his hand on the knob. He finally looked at me, and his eyes were full of a conflict I couldn't understand. "I'll come back tomorrow to do the second coat," he said, his voice flat, professional. And then he was gone. I stood in the middle of my newly painted, half-finished room, the smell of pizza and Steel River thick in the air. The silence that descended was the worst kind yet. It was the silence of a question left unanswered, of a promise broken before it was even made. I had let myself hope. I had stepped out from behind the glass, and I had been left standing alone, covered in paint, with a cold slice of pizza in my hand and a gaping hole in my chest. Complicated. The word was a stone, dropping me back into the cold, gray reality I thought I had just escaped. Sleep didn't come that night. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of the day. The accidental touches, the shared smiles, the way he'd held my hand. And then the final, confusing retreat. Complicated. What did that mean? A girlfriend? A boyfriend? A life I knew nothing about. A life that had no room for a lonely programmer in a quiet apartment. The hope that had bloomed so brightly in my chest was now a cold, hard knot of dread. I had been a fool. It had all been in my head, a fantasy spun from a few kind words and a handsome face. He was just a nice guy being friendly, and I had read it all wrong. The phone call had been his escape hatch, a welcome interruption from the awkward guy who had just non-verbally confessed his feelings over a pizza box. By morning, I had convinced myself it was over. He wouldn't come back. He'd text with a polite excuse. He was sick, he was busy, a pipe had burst somewhere on the other side of town. I would say no problem, and that would be the end of it. I would finish painting the room myself, and try to forget the way it felt to have him there. I would retreat back behind my glass wall, where it was safe, where no one could get close enough to leave. I was sitting at my desk, staring blankly at my laptop, when the buzzer rang at 10 o'clock. The sound was so unexpected it made me flinch. My heart leaped into my throat. It couldn't be. I walked to the intercom on shaky legs. "Hello. It's me." Julian's voice came through, that familiar gravelly tone. He sounded tired. I buzzed him in without a word, my mind a blank slate of shock. I opened the door and waited. He walked up the stairs slowly, not taking them two at a time like he usually did. He wasn't smiling. He looked like he hadn't slept either. His eyes were shadowed, and the stubble on his jaw was thicker. "Hey," he said, stopping in front of me. He wasn't carrying any tools. "Hi," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Can I come in?" I nodded and stepped back. He walked into the living room and stood in the center of the drop cloth, looking at the walls. The room was filled with a tense, heavy silence. "Look, Leo," he started, turning to face me. "About last night. I'm sorry I ran out like that." "It's fine," I said automatically, the pre-programmed response of someone who never wanted to be a bother. "You said it was complicated." "It is," he said, running a hand through his hair in a gesture of frustration. "It's my ex. We broke up months ago, but he doesn't seem to get it. He calls when he's having a crisis, and I still feel responsible." My brain snagged on one word. He. My ex. He. The knot of dread in my stomach didn't disappear, but it changed shape. It was no longer the fear of being wrong, but the fear of being in the way. "You don't have to explain," I said, though I desperately wanted him to. "Yes, I do," he insisted, taking a step closer. "Because leaving like that, especially after what you told me, it wasn't fair to you. I just want you to know it had nothing to do with you. Or with this," he gestured vaguely between us. "This?" I echoed, my voice small. "What is this?" I needed to know. I couldn't live in the ambiguity anymore. He took another step, closing the distance between us until he was standing just a foot away. The air crackled. "This," he said, his voice dropping lower, becoming softer, more intense. "The way you watch me when you think I'm not looking. The way my heart speeds up when you laugh. The way I haven't been able to think about anything else since I first walked into this apartment." Every word was a shock to my system, a dismantling of the fortress of doubt I had built around myself overnight. He had seen it. He had felt it, too. It wasn't just me. I was speechless. My mouth opened, but no sound came out. I could only stare at him, my eyes wide with a terrifying, soaring hope. He saw the look on my face, and his own expression softened. A small, tentative smile touched his lips. I spent all night thinking I'd scared you off, he confessed, his voice barely a whisper. That I'd pushed too hard, too fast. No, I finally managed to say, the word coming out as a choked breath. You didn't. Good, he breathed, the same word he'd used last night, but this time it was a sigh of profound relief. He lifted a hand, as if to touch my face, but then he hesitated, his fingers hovering in the space between us. The uncertainty was back, but this time it felt different. It felt like a question, a request for permission. And in that moment, I knew I had to stop being a passive observer. This man, this incredible, complicated, wonderful man, was standing in my living room, laying his feelings bare, and he was waiting for me. He had initiated everything, pushed every boundary, and now it was my turn. I had to take a step. I closed the final inch of space between us. I leaned in and pressed my lips to his. It was not a confident kiss. It was clumsy, hesitant, a question more than a statement. But it was real. It was me, breaking through the glass. For a second, he was perfectly still, as if in shock. Then I felt his hand come up to cup the back of my neck, his fingers tangling in my hair. He kissed me back, and all the hesitation was gone. His mouth was firm, sure, and unbelievably soft. It was not the desperate, frantic kiss I might have imagined. It was slow, deep, a conversation. It tasted of coffee and sleeplessness and a profound, shared relief. It was a kiss that said, finally. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathless. He rested his forehead against mine, his eyes closed. I could feel the light tremor in his hands. He wasn't just a confident, action-oriented catalyst. He was as vulnerable as I was. I really like you, Leo, he murmured against my skin, the words a warm vibration. I really like you too, I said, and saying it out loud felt like setting a captive bird free. The truth of it, the simple, terrifying, beautiful truth of it, filled the room. He pulled back just enough to look at me, his hazel eyes clear and bright. The guarded frustration was gone, replaced by a look of such open, tender affection that it made my chest ache. He had a smudge of blue paint on his jaw, and I had never seen anything more beautiful. So, he said, a slow, happy grin spreading across his face. You still want to paint this room? I laughed, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy. Yeah, I think I do. Good, he said, his smile widening. Because I'm not going anywhere. And I believed him. I stood there, in the middle of my half-painted room, with his hands on my waist and the smell of hope in the air, and I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that the silence was gone for good. My grayscale world was exploding with color. It was messy and complicated and terrifying, and it was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. The second day of painting was nothing like the first. The quiet, companionable rhythm was replaced by something more playful, more charged. The unspoken tension had been replaced by an unspoken understanding. We worked close together, our shoulders brushing, our arms bumping, and now these touches were not accidents to be analyzed, but small, deliberate affirmations. He'd catch my eye from across the room, and his mouth would quirk into that slow, intimate smile that now felt like it belonged only to me. I'd feel a blush rise in my cheeks, and I wouldn't bother to hide it. There were no more secrets to keep. At one point, I was carefully painting the trim near the ceiling, perched precariously on a step stool. I was concentrating, my tongue poked out in a way I hadn't realized I did until Julian pointed it out with a low chuckle. What? I asked, looking down at him. He was standing at the base of the stool, his hands on his hips, watching me with an expression of fond amusement. Nothing, he said, his eyes sparkling. You're just really cute when you're focused. My hand jerked, sending a small blue smear onto the white ceiling. Damn it. Hey, no worries. He stepped closer, placing a hand on my lower back to steady me. We can fix that. His hand was warm and solid against the thin fabric of my t-shirt. It was meant to be a steadying gesture, but it had the opposite effect. My entire nervous system lit up, all my focus shifting from the paint smudge on the ceiling to the weight and warmth of his hand. I can get it, I said, my voice a little shaky. Let me, he said, his voice a low murmur. He reached past me, taking the small brush from my hand. Our fingers tangled for a moment, a soft, warm friction. He grabbed a rag from his back pocket and, with his other hand still resting firmly on my back, He leaned up, his body pressing lightly against mine as he reached to wipe away the smudge. His face was close to mine, his arm brushing my cheek. I could smell the faint, clean scent of his skin, see the concentration in his eyes as he carefully wiped away the blue paint. I held my breath, my body rigid. He was so close. All I had to do was turn my head. He finished and pulled back, his eyes immediately finding mine. We were inches apart. The air was thick with paint fumes and unspoken words. His gaze dropped to my mouth, and I saw the question in his eyes. This time, I didn't hesitate. I answered. I leaned in and captured his lips. This kiss was different from the first. It was bolder, hungrier. It was the kiss of two people who had spent too long wanting and were finally free to take. His hand slid from my back up to my neck, his thumb stroking the sensitive skin behind my ear, sending shivers down my spine. I let the paintbrush clatter to the drop cloth below, my own hands coming up to frame his face, my fingers sinking into the soft thickness of his hair. It was a long, slow, dizzying kiss that left me lightheaded and clinging to his shoulders for support when we finally broke apart. I was still on the step stool. He was on the floor, and the awkward angle just made it feel more real, more wonderfully imperfect. Maybe we should take a break, he said, his voice rough and breathless. Maybe we should. I agreed, my own voice barely a whisper. We spent the rest of the afternoon not painting. We sat on the couch, which we'd pushed into the center of the room and covered with a sheet. We talked. We talked for hours, filling in the empty spaces of each other's lives. I told him about my quiet childhood, my retreat into the orderly world of computers. He told me about the pressure of his family, his difficult relationship with his father, his messy, painful breakup that had left him feeling adrift. He was not just the confident, capable man I had first seen. He was complex and vulnerable, with his own scars and insecurities. And seeing that, being trusted with that, made me fall for him even harder. It wasn't just a crush on a handsome handyman anymore. It was something deeper, something realer. I was so scared. I admitted to him, my head resting on his shoulder, his arm wrapped securely around me. When you left last night, I thought I had imagined everything. He tightened his arm around me, pressing a kiss to the top of my head. I'm the one who should be sorry. It was a mess, and I brought it to your doorstep. I didn't want you to think it was about you. The thought of you thinking that, after the day we had, it killed me. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, the late afternoon lights streaming through the windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The same dust motes that had once seemed to represent my loneliness now looked like tiny, golden specks of magic. As evening approached, we finished the second coat of paint in a flurry of efficient, synchronized work. The room was done. It was perfect. The deep blue walls gave the space a sense of character, of history, that it had never had before. It felt like my home, finally. We stood in the doorway, admiring our work. Julian's arm was slung casually around my shoulders, my hand resting on his hip. It felt natural. It felt right. It's good, he said quietly. It's really good. We're good. I corrected him softly. We're a good team. He turned to look at me, his smile gentle. Yeah, we are. The job was finished. The excuse for his presence was officially gone. A flicker of the old anxiety sparked in my chest. What now? As if reading my mind, he said, So, I guess my work here is done. His tone was light, but I could hear the underlying question. I turned to face him, my heart in my throat. This was it. The moment of truth. The painting is done, I said, choosing my words carefully. But you're not. His face broke into a wide, relieved grin. Oh yeah? You got more broken stuff for me to fix. No, I said, a slow smile spreading across my own face. I just like having you here. Good, he said, his voice dropping to that low, intimate rumble that sent shivers through me. Because I really like being here. He leaned in and kissed me again, a slow, sweet, promising kiss right there in the doorway of our freshly painted room. It was a kiss that didn't feel like a beginning or an end, but simply a continuation, a confirmation. That night, he didn't leave. After cleaning up the brushes and rollers, we ordered Chinese food and ate it sitting on the floor, laughing about the blue paint smudge that was still on my ceiling because we'd forgotten to fix it. Later, as we were getting ready for bed, a new, awkward tension settled between us. The unspoken question of where he would sleep. I stood awkwardly by my bedroom door. You can take the bed, I offered. I can sleep on the couch. He looked at me, a soft, unreadable expression on his face. He walked over to me, took my hand, and laced his fingers through mine. Leo, he said gently, I want to sleep with you. In the same bed. I want to be next to you. He paused, his gaze searching mine. Is that okay? The simple, direct honesty of it disarmed me completely. He wasn't assuming anything. He was asking. He was giving me a choice. Yes, I said, my voice thick with emotion. That's very okay. Lying in bed with him was a revelation. We lay on our sides, facing each other in the dark. His leg was tangled with mine, his hand resting on my waist. I could feel the warmth of his body, hear the soft, steady rhythm of his breathing. It was the most profound intimacy I had ever experienced, more so than any kiss. It was the simple, quiet act of sharing a space, of being vulnerable and safe in the dark. Hey, he whispered after a long, comfortable silence. Yeah, I whispered back. I'm really glad your pipe broke. I let out a soft laugh, the sound muffled by my pillow. Me too. I fell asleep to the sound of his breathing, wrapped in the scent of his skin and the undeniable, miraculous feeling of not being alone. I had spent years observing life from a distance, and now, here it was, warm and real, and breathing next to me in the dark. I had come home. The next morning, I woke up slowly, drifting up from a deep and dreamless sleep. For a moment, I was disoriented. The light filtering through my window felt different, softer. Then I felt the weight of an arm draped across my waist, the warmth of a body pressed against my back. And it all came rushing back. Julian. He was still here. A wave of pure, unadulterated happiness washed over me, so potent it felt like sunshine spreading through my veins. I lay perfectly still, not wanting to disturb the moment, memorizing the feeling of his solid presence behind me, the steady rise and fall of his chest. This was real. This wasn't a dream. I carefully turned over to face him. He was still asleep, his face relaxed and peaceful in the morning light. His dark hair was a mess, falling across his forehead. His long lashes cast soft shadows on his cheeks. In sleep, he looked younger, more vulnerable. My heart swelled with an emotion so fierce and tender it almost hurt. I wanted to protect this. I wanted to protect him. I resisted the urge to trace the line of his jaw, to brush the hair from his forehead. I just watched him, my gaze tracing the familiar landscape of his face. I was still an observer, I realized, but the nature of my observation had changed. It was no longer the detached analysis of a lonely outsider. It was the careful, loving study of someone who was finally a part of the picture. After a while, his eyes fluttered open. They were hazy with sleep for a moment, and then they focused on me. A slow, lazy smile spread across his face. Morning, he murmured, his voice thick and gravelly with sleep. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. Morning, I whispered back. He shifted closer, nosing into the crook of my neck like a cat. Slept good, he mumbled against my skin, his breath warm. Me too, I said, my hand coming up to rest in his messy hair. It was softer than I'd imagined. We lay like that for a long time, tangled together in the sheets, not speaking, just being. The morning silence was the most beautiful I had ever known. It was full, not empty. It was a silence that didn't need to be filled with words. Eventually, the smell of coffee lured us out of bed. I was pulling on a t-shirt when Julian came up behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist and resting his chin on my shoulder. He pressed a soft kiss to the side of my neck. You know, he said, his voice a low rumble against my back. I could get used to this. Me too, I said, leaning back into his embrace. It felt like coming home. But as we made coffee together in the kitchen, a new kind of anxiety began to creep in. The weekend was over. It was Monday. The real world was waiting. He had a life, a job, an ex who called in crisis. I had my quiet, solitary routine. The last few days had been a magical, paint-splattered bubble. What would happen when that bubble burst? He must have sensed the shift in my mood. He came over to where I was standing by the counter, staring into my coffee cup as if it held the answers to the universe. He gently took the mug from my hands and set it down. He took my face in his hands, forcing me to look at him. Hey, he said softly. What's going on in that big brain of yours? I don't know. I mumbled, unable to meet his eyes. It's Monday. He was silent for a moment. Then he said, yeah, it is. He didn't try to placate me or offer easy reassurances. He just acknowledged the reality of it. I have to go to a job site in an hour. And you probably have code to wizard. My heart sank. So this was it. The end of the fantasy. But, he continued, his thumb stroking my cheeks. I was thinking, after my job today, I could come back. We could move your furniture back into place. And maybe, you could let me cook you dinner. To thank you for letting me crash here. I looked up at him, hope flaring in my chest again. You want to come back? Of course I want to come back, Leo, he said, his expression softening. Did you think this was just a weekend thing for me? I don't know what I thought. I admitted honestly. Well, it's not, he said firmly. This is something I want to figure out. With you. He leaned in and gave me a soft, reassuring kiss. Okay. I breathed, the anxiety melting away, replaced by a warm, steady certainty. He left an hour later, after a long, lingering kiss at the door that left me feeling dizzy and hopeful. I went to my desk and opened my laptop, but for the first time in my life, the lines of code felt secondary. My real life was no longer happening on a screen. It was happening in the real, tangible world. It was the memory of a warm hand in mine, the lingering scent of his soap in my bathroom, the promise of dinner. The day passed in a haze of happy distraction. I was shockingly unproductive, my mind constantly drifting back to him. I'd find myself smiling at my screen for no reason. I replayed our conversations, our kisses, the quiet intimacy of the morning. I was acting like a teenager with their first crush, and I didn't care. It was wonderful. He texted me in the afternoon. Job is taking longer than I thought. Might be late. Don't wait for me to eat. A flicker of the old insecurity sparked. Was this an excuse? A slow fade? I typed and deleted a dozen replies before settling on a simple, casual one. No problem. Just let me know when you're done. I'll save you some leftovers. Hours passed. 6 o'clock became 7, then 8. The sun went down. The leftovers I'd optimistically prepared sat on the counter, getting cold. The old, familiar silence began to creep back into the apartment, its texture heavy and suffocating again. The happy bubble was deflating. I had been a fool to believe it could last. He wasn't coming. It had been a weekend fling, a fun diversion, and now he was back to his real, complicated life. I was just about to put the food in the fridge and resign myself to another quiet, lonely evening when my buzzer rang. It was almost 9 o'clock. I rushed to the intercom, my heart hammering. Julian. Hey. His voice came through, sounding exhausted. Sorry I'm so late. Can I still come up? Of course, I said, relief washing over me so powerfully my knees felt weak. When I opened the door, he looked completely drained. He was covered in dust, and there was a dark smudge of grease on his forehead. He was holding a single, slightly wilted-looking daisy. I passed a bodega on the way here, he said, holding out the flower with a tired, sheepish smile. I know it's not much, but I felt bad for being so late. I took the daisy from him, my fingers brushing his. It was the single most romantic gesture anyone had ever made for me. It's perfect, I said, my voice thick with emotion. Thank you. He came inside and slumped onto the couch, letting out a long, weary sigh. That was a nightmare job. Everything that could go wrong did. I'm sorry, I said, sitting down next to him. I put the daisy in a glass of water on the coffee table. It's okay, he said, leaning his head back and closing his eyes. It's over now. And I'm here. He opened his eyes and looked at me. This was the only thing that got me through the last 5 hours. Knowing I was coming here. And just like that, all my doubts, all my insecurities, vanished into thin air. It wasn't a fantasy. It was real. It was a tired man, covered in dust, bringing me a wilted flower at the end of a long day because he wanted to be here, with me, more than anywhere else. I'm glad you're here, I said, my voice soft. He reached out and took my hand, his grip firm and sure. Me too. He looked around the room, at the perfect blue walls, at the furniture still clustered in the center. So, he said, a hint of his usual energy returning. You ready to put this place back together? And so we did. We spent the next hour moving furniture, the easy, comfortable rhythm of teamwork returning as if it had never left. We pushed the couch back against the wall, hung my pictures, and rolled up the drop cloths. With each piece we put back in place, the room felt more and more like a home we were building together. When we were finally done, we stood in the middle of the room, admiring our work. It was the same room, but it was completely different. It was filled with color, with memories, with the promise of a future. "It's perfect," I said. "Yeah," he agreed, his arm sliding around my waist. "It is." He pulled me closer, his body warm and solid against mine. "But I'm still hungry." I laughed. "I saved you some food." As I heated up his dinner, he came up behind me in the kitchen, wrapping his arms around me just as he had that morning. He rested his chin on my shoulder, his lips close to my ear. "You have paint in your hair," he whispered. I turned in his arms to face him. "You have a flower on your coffee table," I whispered back. He smiled, a slow, tender smile that made my heart ache. "I think it's a fair trade." He leaned in to kiss me, but paused, his eyes searching mine. The playfulness was gone, replaced by a raw, naked vulnerability. "Leo," he said, his voice barely audible. This is real for me." I brought my hand up to his cheek, my thumb stroking the rough stubble on his jaw. "I know," I said. "It's real for me, too." The kiss that followed was not about passion or hunger. It was about recognition. It was about acceptance. It was a quiet, solemn vow made in the low light of my kitchen, surrounded by the smell of leftover food and fresh paint. It was the beginning of everything. We didn't talk much after that. There was nothing left to say. We had moved beyond the need for words, for reassurances. We ate, we cleaned up together, and we fell into bed, our bodies fitting together as if they were made for it. As I drifted off to sleep, curled against his chest, I thought about the silence. It was still there, a soft, peaceful blanket covering the apartment. But it was no longer my companion. Julian was. And his presence was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. The quiet hum of his breathing was the only soundtrack I would ever need. I was no longer an observer. I was home. It was in the small, unpainted moments that followed that I truly understood what was happening. It was in the way he started leaving a toothbrush in my bathroom, a spare t-shirt in my drawer. It was in the easy way he moved around my kitchen, knowing where the mugs were, how I liked my coffee. My apartment, once a fortress of solitude, was slowly, imperceptibly, becoming our space. One evening, about a week after we'd finished painting, he was at my place after a long day. I was at my desk, trying to untangle a particularly nasty bit of code, my brow furrowed in concentration. He was on the couch, sketching in a notebook, the soft scratch of his pencil a comforting counterpoint to the click of my keyboard. "You're doing the tongue thing again," he said, his voice laced with amusement. I glanced over, my concentration broken. He was watching me with that fond, familiar look. "I am not," I said, immediately self-conscious. "You are," he insisted, holding up his notebook. He had drawn a quick, surprisingly accurate caricature of me, hunched over my laptop, a tiny pink tongue sticking out of the corner of my mouth. I couldn't help but laugh. "Okay, fine. You caught me." He smiled and went back to his drawing. A few minutes later, he said, "Hey, Leo, can I ask you something?" "Anything," I said, turning in my chair to face him fully. He hesitated, his pencil stilling on the page. Before me, were you happy? The question was so direct, so vulnerable, it caught me off guard. I thought about my life before the broken pipe. The grayscale existence, the quiet, repeating loops. Was I unhappy? Not actively. But I wasn't happy either. I was dormant. "I wasn't unhappy," I said slowly, choosing my words with care. "I was just waiting. I didn't know what I was waiting for. But my life felt like a prelude to something. Like the opening credits were rolling, but the movie never started." He looked at me, his hazel eyes full of a deep, startling empathy. "I know that feeling," he said quietly. "I think I was waiting too." In that moment, I saw our shared loneliness not as a void, but as a space we had been keeping for each other, without even knowing it. We were two solitary islands that had finally, miraculously, drifted close enough to form a continent. He closed his sketchbook and set it aside. He patted the cushion next to him. "Come here," he said softly. I abandoned my work without a second thought, crossing the room and sinking onto the couch beside him. He immediately wrapped an arm around me, pulling me against his side. I rested my head on his shoulder, breathing in his familiar scent of sawdust and soap. "Is the movie starting now?" I asked, my voice muffled against his shirt. I felt his chest rumble with a low chuckle. He pressed a kiss into my hair. Yeah, he said. I think it is. It was in these quiet confessions, these shared moments of vulnerability, that our connection deepened, its roots growing strong in the soil of our past solitudes. It wasn't a whirlwind romance. It was a slow, deliberate construction, like the way he'd carefully fitted those copper pipes together. It was a quiet, sturdy thing we were building together, piece by piece. There were still moments of awkwardness, of course. We were two people who had spent a long time alone, learning to navigate the world as a unit of one. Now, we had to learn the dance of we. There were clumsy negotiations over what to watch on TV, moments of silence that felt less comfortable and more uncertain. One night, the inevitable test came. His phone buzzed with a text. He glanced at it, and I saw the familiar, frustrated tension return to his jaw. It was his ex. The old, cold fear pricked at me. I tried to ignore it, to pretend I hadn't seen his expression change. I kept my eyes fixed on the book I was reading. He let out a heavy sigh. I'm sorry, he said, his voice tight. It's him again. His car broke down on the other side of town. Oh, I said, my voice carefully neutral. Are you going to go? He has other friends he can call, Julian said. But he was already standing up, running a hand through his hair. The pull of old responsibility was strong. I could see the conflict warring in his eyes. You should go, I said, and the words surprised me as much as they seemed to surprise him. The old me would have been silent, letting my fear and insecurity curdle into resentment. But this new me, the me that was building something with this man, knew that trust was a choice. He looked at me, his expression unreadable. You're okay with that? No, I said honestly. I'm not. I want you to stay here. But I know you. And I know you won't be able to relax until you know he's okay. So go. Be the good guy I know you are. He stared at me for a long moment, a look of dawning realization on his face. He walked over to me, crouched down in front of me, and took my hands in his. Thank you, he said, his voice thick with an emotion I couldn't quite name. He leaned in and kissed me, a quick, firm, grateful kiss. I won't be long. I promise. He left, and the apartment was quiet again. But this time, the silence wasn't empty. It wasn't a void. It was just a pause. I trusted him. I trusted us. And that trust was a warm, steady flame in the quiet of the room. I went back to my book and, for the first time, I was able to read, to lose myself in the story, because I knew my own story was waiting for me, and he would be back to help me write the next chapter. He returned 2 hours later, looking tired but settled. He walked in, dropped his keys in the bowl by the door, a bowl that was now for our keys, and came straight to me. He pulled me up from the couch and into his arms, holding me tightly. I called his friend to come get him, he said into my hair. And then I told him not to call me anymore. Not for things like that. I told him I couldn't be his emergency contact anymore. Because I have someone else. Because I'm with you. I pulled back, my eyes wide. You did. I did, he confirmed, his gaze steady and sure. It's over. It's done. My complicated past is now just my past. He cupped my face in his hands. My present and my future. That's you, Leo. If you'll have me. Tears welled in my eyes, hot and sudden. Tears of relief, of joy, of a love so profound it felt like it could tear me apart and put me back together, whole and new. I'll have you, I whispered, my voice breaking. He smiled, a beautiful, brilliant smile that lit up his whole face. He wiped a tear from my cheek with his thumb. Good, he said softly, because I'm not going anywhere. And in that moment, standing in the middle of our living room, with the deep blue walls holding us in their calm embrace, I knew that was the truth. The long, quiet prelude of my life was over. The movie had started, and it was more beautiful, more colorful, and more real than anything I could have ever imagined. The silence was gone, replaced by the steady, rhythmic beat of two hearts, finally in sync. The final proof came on a rainy Tuesday. I was trying to leave for a rare in-person meeting at my office, wrestling with a faulty zipper on my jacket. It was stuck, and the more I pulled, the more stubbornly it refused to budge. This stupid thing, I muttered, my frustration mounting. I was going to be late. Julian, who had been reading on the couch, got up and came over. Here, let me see. I turned my back to him, still yanking uselessly at the tab. It's hopeless. I'm just going to have to wear a different jacket. Hold still, he said, his voice calm and steady. He put his hands on my shoulders, a warm, grounding weight. Stop fighting it. I let my hands drop, exhaling in a rush of frustration. He reached around me, his arms encircling me in a loose embrace. His large, capable hands found the zipper. I could feel the warmth of his chest against my back, his chin brushing the top of my head as he leaned over to get a better look. See, the fabric is caught, he murmured, his voice a low vibration against my spine. You just have to be gentle. He worked at it for a moment, his fingers deft and patient. I stood completely still, my whole body hyper-aware of his proximity, of the casual, domestic intimacy of the moment. This was us. This was our life now, fixing things together. Then, with a soft rasp, the zipper came free. There, he said, his voice still low and close to my ear. But instead of zipping it up, or letting go, he did something else. He held the metal tab, a small, cold point of contact against my stomach. And he pulled, not up, but towards him. He reeled me in. I stumbled back a step, my body flush against his. My head tilted back, my throat exposed. I looked up at him, my eyes wide with surprise. His face was inches from mine, his hazel eyes dark and intense, all playfulness gone, replaced by a raw, undisguised wanting. Julian, I whispered, my voice barely a breath. He didn't answer. His gaze dropped to my mouth. He leaned in slowly, deliberately, giving me every chance to pull away. I didn't. I couldn't. And then, just as his lips were about to meet mine, he shifted, his mouth catching my lower lip between his teeth. Not hard, just a gentle, possessive bite. A claim. A bolt of pure, unadulterated electricity shot through me, from my scalp to my toes. My breath hitched. My hands came up to grip his forearms, my knuckles white. It was the most audacious, confident, and breathtakingly intimate thing anyone had ever done to me. It was a summary of everything he was. A playful instigator, a steady presence, a man who knew what he wanted and wasn't afraid to take it. He held me like that for a heart-stopping moment, his eyes locked on mine, a silent conversation passing between us that spoke of passion and possession and a love that was as fierce as it was tender. Then, he released my lip, his mouth immediately covering mine in a deep, soul-shattering kiss that tasted of coffee and rain and the promise of forever. When he finally pulled back, I was breathless, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I stared at him, my mind a blissful, buzzing blank. A slow, wicked smile spread across his face. He reached up and gently zipped my jacket, the sound loud in the quiet room. There, he said, his voice a low, satisfied purr. All fixed. I just stared at him, my lower lip still tingling, my entire world tilted on its axis. The meeting, the time, the rain outside. It all faded away into insignificance. All that existed was him, his mischievous smile, and the dizzying, beautiful certainty that I was exactly where I was supposed to be. You're going to be late, he said, his eyes dancing. I shook my head slowly, a dawning smile spreading across my own face. No, I said, my voice full of a confidence I'd never felt before. I'm not. I'm calling in sick. His smile widened. Oh yeah. Yeah, I said, my hands sliding from his forearms up to his neck, pulling him down to me. I think I have a fever. And as he kissed me again, I knew it was true. I had a fever, and the only cure was him. My life wasn't a movie anymore. It was better. It was real, and I wouldn't have traded it for anything.